Dear friends, greetings and welcome to the discussion on global order post-Trump era, sponsored by IBAT, the think tank, that's Indian Bureau of Administrators and Technocrats. Dear friends, American policies impact India in many ways. Concerns in India is majorly about the dependability of United States as a security partner. The past few years have seen a considerable deepening of India-US relations in the military and strategic sphere. We in India are keen and interested to know how will Biden era be. Will it continue the international policies of Trump or will it be back to the Obama era? One may love or hate Trump era, but his era surely cannot be ignored. Trump, during his regime, had pointed out at the reality. He asked several uncomfortable questions about the failing American foreign policies. He asked, why was America still fighting wars in the Middle East and elsewhere? Why wasn't it partnering with Russia against the jihadis? Why was China allowed to abuse and overtake the America or abuse the rules of the game? And why were so-called allies in Europe allowed to place high tariffs on American produce while American workers had paid for their defense? Dear friends, Trump had made allies to pay more for their own defense, led the global change in attitude against China, and kept the United States out of any new wars. He was successful in brokering deals in the Middle East to normalize the ties with Israel. He had new line of communication with North Korea. Dear friends, we have two eminent speakers and subject experts. The first speaker of our today's session is Dr. Dattesh Parulekar. He's a faculty member in International Relations and Strategic Studies at Department of International Relations, School of International and Area Studies, Goa University. His areas of specialization can span India's foreign policy and diplomacy, Latin American political economy, Chinese political economy, strategic maritime affairs with respect to the Indo-Pacific, etc. He was Fulbright Research Fellow in pursuance of his PhD and undertook a stint at Conflict Management Center of the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, Washington, D.C., USA. He is a visiting faculty at most Indian defense institutions. Besides, he is also professionally involved with nationalist-minded think tanks in India. That is India Foundation, New Delhi, through its Indian Ocean conferences and the Kautilya Fellows program and the Forum for Integrated National Security, being the vice president of its Goa chapter, as also a resource person, mentor to their Young Scholars Forum initiative.
So at the outset, let me express my profound pleasure at being able to join you and IBAT on this particular forum today, and also to be able to join a very dear friend and esteemed colleague in Dr. Nanda Kishor on this topic, which is extremely intriguing, very fascinating, and highly pertinent to our times. Now, before we get into the post-Trump era world order, let's try and understand what have been the profound transformations which have been happening over the last few years that has basically got us to this point. And quite clearly, since the global economic and financial crisis of 2008, we've seen a world order which is in constant unfoldment, in constant transformation, and therefore having embraced a kind of fluidity and flux like never before. And why do I say that? Because if you go back to the Cold War times, you can see very clearly a G2 formation where you had two global powers who virtually carved up the world into their spheres of influence. And for the large part, these spheres of influence were mutually exclusive of each other. So if you were an American ally, you couldn't have been a kind of a partner of the Soviet Union and vice versa. Since the end of the Cold War, for almost 2 decades, we saw a kind of unipolar world where the US was clearly the runaway global power, but there were a number of different security challenges which the United States was facing, and the US really had nobody to fall back on. So it was a kind of a unipolar world order where, for right or wrong, the US would obviously have to share the global responsibility. And for the last 10 odd years, we are now seeing the emergence of another G2, this time between United States and China, but a G2 on very different terms. Because what we are seeing over the last 10 years is not a mutually exclusive world. If anything, the globalized world today is a world of amazing intertwining, interconnectedness, and interdependence. And it is this interconnectedness and interdependence which makes the world today complexly interdependent. And it is this complex interdependence in which we have to account for the new kind of great power rivalry which is emerging between the United States and China. I mean, just look, for example, at one stat. The US and China today are the largest trading, one of the largest trading partners of each other. And you could not have expected this between the US and the Soviet Union back in the Cold War times. If you look at the level of industrial intermediation and technological intertwining that the US and China have had until Trump came and torpedoed some of these things, it was of a kind you could never have imagined between the Soviet Union and the US. So we have to keep this at the back of our mind before we try and chart out a new world order, or we try and understand what are the main underpinnings of this world order. We also see very clearly, because of this complex interdependence, the idea of decoupling either from China or from the United States is a misnomer. It's not going to work. And you're seeing that at various levels, that countries are trying to rely on the US for military and security needs, but increasingly are casting their lot with China when it comes to issues of commerce, investment, and trade. And this seems to be something that has been going on even in the 4 years of Trump, and I probably envisage this continuing for the foreseeable future, which is very evident in the fact that in the last few years, and particularly the last few months, in the waning days of the Trump presidency, we see that there is intensive courtship going on between Beijing and Washington, trying to win over smaller countries in the Indo Pacific. I mean, for many of you who might be following global geopolitics very closely, there has been increasing coordination between India and US in the Indian Ocean in particular over the last few months of the Trump presidency. And we saw how India and US have been making joint efforts to win over Bangladesh, to win over Sri Lanka, to win over Maldives, to win over Myanmar, and to ensure that these countries are not fully in the lot of China. And subsequently, the Chinese visits also to many of the ASEAN countries, many of the Indian Ocean countries, has also intensified because China recognizes that there is definitely a pushback against its own desire for centrality in world affairs. Having said this, we also have to keep in mind that there are some very, very contradictory, patterns that are confluencing today. In the last 4 years, there's no doubt to what Dr. Shetty said in terms of Trump being able to plot and plug in on the right questions. But where I would disagree very, very humbly with you is in terms of the instrumentalities and the approach that he took. It's very fine to ask the right questions and to basically kind of rough up the entire foreign policy establishment, but the approach needed to be coordinated, curated, and tailor made if China really had to be checked. In fact, I would go so far as to say that in the last 4 years, leave out what Trump has done over the last 8 9 months of his presidency, Trump's disjointed approach to global affairs, the fact that he actually frayed his own alliance partners, he sent his relationship with Europe into disrepair. He began to seem to punish Japan, South Korea, even Australia, which are your cornerstone allies in East Asia and the Asia Pacific. His messaging to India was often basically more normative than really in terms of practicality. All of this led to the acceleration of China's rise. In fact, the abdication of the United States from world affairs, the retreat that the United States practiced in world affairs over the last 4 years, and more so, the fact that America was seen as whining and carping, whereas China was seen as a country looking to offer solutions. This actually, in my own hypothesis, accelerated China's strategic ascent over the last 4 years. So much so that today we have to ask the question, what kind of an approach is Biden going to have? Because this is the fundamental dilemma that Biden is facing. He's not facing even a China of 2016. He's now facing a China of 2020, and he may be steeped in the approach of Obama. So, this is where he's going to have a fundamental dilemma, that his impulses are those that go back to the Obama period, which facilitated China's rise as a kind of a G2. But he is dealing now at the back end of a Trump presidency, where China's capacities to deliver to countries in the neighborhood and beyond, China's power projection capabilities have suddenly expanded. And we have seen that since the pandemic, that China has seemed to be a country, whether we like it or not, it seemed like a country which is more in control of itself, making a quick economic rebound, while the United States has been grappling not only with the worst economic crisis, but also with the worst public emergency and health crisis. So we have to keep this in mind. Thirdly, the strategic world order is also going to be further challenged by the nature of China's rise. And what do I mean by it? If you look at the USSR when it rose, it was largely an ideologically driven communist party, an artificially brought together country, which was effectively looking for a sphere of influence, but the number of verticals in which it had a pioneering presence was very, very limited. I mean, no one ever talked about the Soviet economy in the way in which we talk about the stranglehold that the Chinese economy has on the global economy. Even today, we hear that by 2028, 29, China is going to eclipse the US as the largest economy in the world. And by 2050, when its fertility rates would have dropped, it still would be accounting for 40 to 45% of global GDP. This was never an issue with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was always seen through the prism and lens of its runaway military power. But in the case of China, why it becomes a more challenging and a more predatory threat is because its strategic ascent has elements of predatory rise and elements of pioneering rise. There are elements, for example, technology. You could never have imagined talking about China in terms of technological superiority, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, when we still basically rubbish Chinese technology. But today, even the United States is having to acknowledge that China has arrived on the technological scene. And that is why, when we look at a world order where China today is seen as the predator and seen as basically challenging the basic tenets of the world order, it is trying to come to terms with the predatory aspects of China, but also the technologically pioneering aspects of China, which is going to be a big dilemma not only for the United States but also for a number of countries. I believe that there are four C's, which I think are going to be arch pillars of the world order going forward. The first C is commerce. And why do I say commerce? Because we all understand, as we are coming out of this global, public health crisis, which is also an attendant economic crisis, that the only way to propel economies out of their current situation, which is a huge deep hole, is to be able to enhance and expand trade. So trade and investment relationships are going to be very, very critical. And this is where I want to point out that Trump turned his back on the TPP, when actually he should have been taking up the TPP and ensuring that at least the United States is the leader in the Asia Pacific, if not the Indo Pacific, with its cornerstone economic allies, driving a trade regional pact, unlike what the Chinese are doing now. Today, unfortunately, the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and this is very interesting. Despite the fact that countries have deep concerns in the region about China, they saw to it, including Vietnam, which of course is a feisty neighbor of China, they saw to it that RCEP does not get delayed, but actually RCEP is kept on schedule. I think this, unfortunately, was a big thumbs up to China in the light of America abdicating the TPP and walking away from TPP. So there is a huge now, kind of speculation happening whether Biden's going to waste any more time or he's going to rush back and try to formalize a TPP, because in the absence of a trans-Pacific partnership, regional trading bloc, the Chinese-led bloc, which will involve the ASEAN countries and your East Asian neighbors, including Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific, will become the dominant regional trade theme in this region, which we will have to contend with. The second is connectivity. And here it's very clear that what we are seeing now are two competitive visions of connectivity. The Chinese vision of connectivity is project-based capitalism, as I call it. It's basically capitalism. They are basically stepping into countries' sovereign territories. They're building infrastructure. And then basically on the strength of the debt that is created in those countries, they are able to essentially trade these territories for equity. But what is the option? And I've always been saying this: if you want to push back against China, it has to be through tangible initiatives. The Asia Africa Growth Corridor, which was promoted by Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe, was an excellent initiative. And it was an initiative that was based on very sound principles, which are the underpinnings of a democratic, civilized world order. But we also have to acknowledge that because of troubles in respective countries, and we are democracy, so there are many challenges that come up to policy making. The AAGC has not moved at the kind of speed it should have moved, as a result of which, what is the dominant narrative today? Will the BRI collapse? I would say, ask the question, regardless of whether the BRI collapses, do we have a tenable alternative to the BRI? Yes, credit to Trump. Last February, when he came here and met with Prime Minister Modi, he proposed the Blue Dot Network to New Delhi. We were cautious to begin with. What one understands is we are quite supportive of the Blue Dot Network right now, and it is widely believed that there will be pressure on the Biden administration not to dump BDN just because it was a Trump initiative, but actually take it up, because the Blue Dot Network initiative that the Americans are propounding with Indo-Pacific partners, with India being very critical in that, I think if that can be taken to its logical conclusion over the next decade or so, can be a viable challenger to China's Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's very important. The third is compact, and this is very important. The American vision of a world order has largely been an alliance-driven world order. But today, countries are not interested in alliances which bind them down into any one set of rules or institutions. They would like to rather explore strategic partnerships which have mutually beneficial outcomes. At the same time, they give them strategic maneuverability in foreign policy. And that's why the world order now is going to be driven less by cornerstone alliances of the kind that the US did with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia during the Cold War period, or for that matter, even with Philippines, and more with the kind of strategic partnership, for example, that they're building with India, and the kind of partnerships which can be taken forward with many other countries. For example, through, for example, the Quad. The Quad is a good example of a partnership between four democracies. It's not an alliance. It's a partnership where they're coming together to be able to subserve certain strategic goals. So it is the partnership over alliances which is going to be very important. And the last one in this arch pillar is global commons. Because at the end of the day, what is China trying to do? Through China's domination and power projection, they are trying to convert their centrality in today's global geopolitics into Chinese centricity. Now, that is not assured. It's highly unlikely that it will happen, because with China, the relationship that China has with most of its peers is what I call transactionalism without trust. There is no level of trust with China, but there is a high degree of transactionalism that even China's feisty neighbors have with it. Best example, Japan and Vietnam. They don't have trust in China, but China remains their biggest trading partners. And that's how you look at transactionalism without trust. So the global commons is where governance architecture is going to be critical. And that is where India, the United States, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, let's say Singapore, and other countries who really want, even for that matter, European countries now, who have shaped up their own Indo-Pacific policy, they will be critical in preserving the global commons. And it is the preservation of the global commons away from the predatory control of China, which is going to be important. So in this context, where is President Biden and what do we expect? Let me talk a little bit, about a minute or so, on the Indo-US relationship. There is no doubt that the Indo-US relationship has grown on the dial for the last 20 plus years, ever since the historic visit of President Clinton to India, and when the natural alliance or the natural partners phrase was used for the first time. Across administrations on both ends of the spectrum, we have seen a bipartisan consensus emerge about the strength of India-US relations. And India-US relations have witnessed an upswing. However, we must also be realistic to admit that despite the foundational pacts which we have signed since Trump came to office, starts of course with LEMOA, moves on to COMCASA, we've also signed the Strategic Trade Authorization Tier 1, we have BECA, we now have the International Security Annex. Despite of all these foundational pacts, the fact remains there are critical irritants in the India-US relationship, that keep our relationship from elevating to that unique strategic level, which can be much beyond a strategic partnership, but is not necessarily a fundamental security alliance. I think that challenge is going to be very big. I say this because we've seen the recent document that's been declassified, which of course was the Trump administration's institutional approach of accelerating India's rise. So far, what we have heard from the Biden administration is they would like to continue with that policy of accelerating India's rise. But the terms on which that accelerated rise will happen will also be very critical, because let's not forget, we are yet far away from being able to work out a free trade deal, or for that matter, even a comprehensive trade and investment pact with the United States. Even on in terms of defense equipment, right now what we are seeing largely is basically armament procurement by India. We have not been able to take the defense trade and technology initiative to that level where the seamless intermediation between our different institutions happen. So that level of confidence has still not been reached, but hopefully the rise of China and the consequences of that rise will push the Biden administration to move away from the view that the progressives have in the Democratic Party, which is to basically find a modus vivendi with China, not to push too far on China, and to be able to actually take on China. The next point will be in terms of what does Biden do in terms of looking at our relationship with Russia, because Dr. Shetty mentioned Russia, and this is where we are going to have this fundamental problem in the world order, because on the one hand, the Americans today seem to be more transfixed on facing the Russian challenge than addressing the Chinese challenge. For us, it remains the Chinese challenge as opposed to the Russian challenge. But at a systemic level, let's not forget that the Russians and the Chinese, regardless of certain issues they may have between themselves, they are increasingly working in tandem. Because President Putin has realized that if he has to remain the strategic disruptor that he is, if he wants to maintain his global standing as a global power, he needs the support of China. If there is no China along with him, Russia gets badly isolated, as you saw with the annexation of Crimea and the subsequent sanctions that came on Russia, the way in which Russia was thrown out of the G8, and the way in which they were insulted at the Brisbane G20 in 2014. So Putin has seen this, and Putin wants to work closely with China. So the problem is going to be the Americans are transfixed with Russia. India recognizes that China is the bigger challenge, but within the larger Indo-Pacific, I think it is a Russia-China alliance or a Russia-China compact that is going to be very critical as a challenge for us to see. Lastly, I will leave you with one point, which is there are critical issues on which India and the US are going to have to find some degree of synergy. And I think that still hasn't happened. Even though both sides have agreed on an Indo-Pacific formulation, you have the Indo-Pacific Command, you have the Americans playing a greater role in the Indian Ocean. But given that President Biden is going to be focused on the pandemic and on the economic issues, not just for this year, but I guess maybe even deep into 2022, the ability of India to be able to synergize its priorities with America is going to be a big challenge. And this is where Indian diplomats will have to engage very strongly, not just with counterparts in the Biden administration, but to call upon certain individuals within the US government over the years who have really played a great role in strengthening the Indo-US compact, because it's only the Indo-US compact which can become the linchpin to a larger pushback against China across the Indo-Pacific. You can't expect that with a US Australia or a US Japan or a US South Korea, or for that matter, even a US ASEAN relationship.